So I'm going to give a little talk today. It's all about whether we should be trading the body parts of endangered and threatened species to save them or not. It's a hugely contentious issue. Oopsie, why isn't this now not really? So my name's Colin Bell. I'm a 65-year-old pale male. And there's a huge division in South Africa between the traders and the non-traders. But one of the key things is that so often the debate gets clouded because hunting is brought into the debate. And please, folks, what we need to do is separate. Today, we're talking about trade. We're not talking about hunting. Hunting is a totally separate debate and a totally different story. You can be a hunter and you can be anti-trade. And I just wanted to focus that all we're doing tonight is talking about trade, whether it's viable or not. And I'm going to take you through a whole lot of different examples of why I believe that trade should be completely banned. There's no gray mark there, no gray at all in this whole story. And my only motive is that I love to know that my grandchildren will be able to go and enjoy the wildlife spectacles that I've had the privilege of enjoying in my life. And I'm really worried. I don't believe that they will have the opportunities we had because some of the policies we're putting in place, often with good intentions. So I'm putting myself out there. I hope for you'll take it as a constructive comment and constructive arguments. But I really want to try and bring a lot of the points into the open because there's so much misinformation flying around. So let's go. And I think one of the reasons why I started to put my hands up to give this talk is that we've got a new Minister of Environment, Fisheries and Forestry in South Africa, Minister Cristian. And Parliament has really done a lot of debating in South Africa. Parliament's done huge amounts of discussions. We've had all sorts of elephant debates and all the rest of it. And there is a solid amount of policy already in South Africa. And yet Barbara Cristian comes into power and immediately we start to see complete chops and changes to everything. One of the things which is on the go right now is the terms of reference and the appointment of a high-level panel of experts, which are going to go and look at trade in rhino and rhino horn, domestic trade or no, all these different things, trade in elephant ivory, ivory export. This has all been discussed and debated and put to bed. The elephant norms and stands is waiting on her desk to discuss. And yet we've now got a brand new panel of over 20 people, all heavily biased towards trade. And then things like trade in lion bones and leopard skins, and whether it's got conservation value. This has been discussed and debated forever. So I'm really worried about what's going on behind the scenes here. And then we have a different department, Department of Agriculture, is trying to discuss whether we should be debating and considering legalizing rhino meat consumption. We've got big picture issues which are being destroyed at the moment. This whole shark finning industry might be a 30 million rand industry, but it's affecting and it's carved up a billion tourism industry, which is renewable and keeps on going. We've got shark finners in the waters right now, and they are having such a devastating impact on the environment off our coasts. So much so that the shark tourism industry has dropped by half. It's a R1 billion industry, it's dropped by half to R500 million, and just the VAT on that drop is about 90 million rand. What, to support an industry which is maybe a 30 million and supports a handful of people? Something's going wrong. And things like, just the other day, she gave the go-ahead for mining in Western Cape beaches. There's something going on in South Africa which I've never seen, the level of destruction, with the aim of creating a few short-term jobs. But at the long term, we're going to have massive environmental issues, and we're going to lose a lot of long-term, many more big jobs. And then finally on the weekend, I don't know if you saw this episode on Carte Blanche, but this is an extraordinary report which came out, very well researched, over 100 pages, where they tracked the live export of over 5,000 animals out of South Africa, all with permits, and just about every animal, the CITES permits were incorrectly or fraudulently done. And so we've got a meltdown. We've got a complete meltdown. And we actually, as a citizen group, have to start saying, hang on, we have to start holding the government to account. because what's going on here is not going to be conducive to our grandkids going to be enjoying the privileges that we've had today. So, who am I? I was one of the lucky guys, came out of university with a degree in economics. I'm an economist, and I'm talking today as an economist. But I happened to get into an industry which was my passion. So 1977, I arrived in Botswana as a 23-year-old guide, and it was rough and ready. But we had rhinos. We had the most extraordinary rhinos all the way through. In the Okavango, Maremi, all the way through to Savuti, up to Chobe, there were rhinos everywhere. And over the time, from the 70s into the 80s, we started to see the rhino populations go down. And then the carcasses increased. And then one day, in the mid to late 80s, suddenly there were no more rhinos. We had witnessed an extinction under our very noses. We had watched an extinction happen. And you kind of quite blasé about an extinction as it's happening. You're seeing fewer and fewer rhinos, and you kind of, it concerns you, but you don't jump up until the lights go off. And the moment the lights go off and there's no more rhinos, you have an incredible emptiness in your soul. And on all the safaris from then onwards, doesn't matter what we saw, eventually, somewhere during that 10, 12, 14-day safari, you'd be asked the question, and you knew it would come every single safari. Colin, why are we not seeing rhinos? And you'd have to explain that this was an extinction. On our watch, under our noses, we had witnessed an extinction. And that emptiness in your soul made us promise to ourselves at Wilderness Safaris that we were going to go and reintroduce rhinos. And we had this program. We had an area called Mombo at the top of the delta. It was completely surrounded by water. And we went to the government over almost 8 years. And eventually we got the SADC Rhino fellows in there, and they did a survey of all the environment, and they came up and said, this is the perfect place to reintroduce rhinos. And finally, after a whole lot of, almost a decade of lobbying, the government allowed us to go and reintroduce the rhinos. We paid for the extinction. I signed the first check. And I've got this privilege of being one of the few people on this planet to have witnessed an extinction in a country and then been able to reverse that extinction. It was an amazing project. We built the bomas, brought the rhinos in, got them settled down. And that day when the rhinos were released were one of the happiest days of my life. And whenever you could go on safaris, you knew, although there weren't many, that there was no longer an extinction. You could see rhinos in the wild. And Botswana's had a remarkable success stories up until last year, and I'll get to that, with both black and white rhinos thriving in the Okavango Delta and moving around. And we were fortunate to have a no-nonsense government. And I think one of the tricks of being successful, we've seen it in Chad, we've seen it in Rwanda, we've seen it in Nepal, when you've got a government which is totally behind you and backs you to the hilt, it does help. So I talk as an economist, I talk as somebody who's witnessed an extinction and been part of solving that extinction. And today's talk is really all about a bunch of speculators. There's a whole lot of people, probably no more than 10, who went out and speculated that rhino horn was worth very little today, but if they could change international legislation, they would be able to make a huge amount of money. So they went quietly behind the scenes and they worked their way through first the officials in Kruger Park, then into sand parks. And they were a quiet bunch of guys who were starting to collect and breed rhinos and put them into a couple of secured locations around South Africa. And quietly, without anybody knowing, they got right into cabinet. There was a process called RIM, the Rhinos Issues Management Process, which quietly lobbied a few people and got the rhino trade into cabinet, and it was approved that we would go to Bangkok, CITES in Bangkok, with a proposal to go and trade our rhino horn. My goodness, nobody had heard about it. And out of the blue, we watching our minister talk about rhino horn. Fortunately, to get a proposal to CITES, you've got to put it on the agenda about 150 days before the actual conference. And they were too late, but they were given the slot and they announced that they're going to trade rhino horn. And we got the shock of our lives. Not one single person in the tourism industry. Remember, the tourism industry employs and has got dependents. 1 in 7 South Africans depends on tourism to put food on their table every day. 1 in 7. And the entire tourism industry was circumvented, even though the tourism industry is very much geared around two big icons. Number one, our wildlife, and number two, Cape Town. And the wildlife is all around the big five. And they were not consulted once. And when this poll went out, when this happened, 82% of the tourism industry said no trade. It was a startling revelation that suddenly we were faced that we're going to go and try and trade our rhino. And as an economist, I knew what the consequences would be. So now it's all the open. An organization called PROA, Private Rhinos Association, went out there. They raised a lot of money. And they did a huge amount of lobbying. You saw all these articles on Sunday Times and magazines, and people were flying around the world to go and lobby. And the lobby was incredibly successful. It was a campaign which many people should note of how to run a successful campaign. And it was on the radios, it was everywhere. But who are these speculators? And this is from 2012, the last time we had really good, accurate stats. The blue for black and white rhinos is state. The green is some custodianship, and the kind of beige, reddish color is in private hands. And the speculators had a tiny portion. And yet the amount of noise these guys were able to create, because they made it sound as though they represented all the rhino owners. I, in my own small way, am a rhino owner. I was never consulted. And a lot of the game lodgers joined up, but quickly pulled back. And today we've got much fewer rhinos, and yes, their shares increased, but they certainly are below a quarter of the total rhinos in South Africa. And yet they dominate the scene. And I want to go through how they dominate and the myths they put out. So let's talk about some of the speculators' myths which drive their campaign. And it's, as I said, it's a very clever, successful campaign, and it's based on one-liners. One sound bites which sound magnificent. And we hear them like myth number one. South Africa can flood the Asian markets with rhino horn from horn shavings and future mortalities to satisfy the demand and therefore stop poaching. It's a brilliant campaign. And when you look at it, you say, wow, let's go and shave our rhino horns. Let's go and flood Asia. We'll stop the poaching. We'll raise a lot of money, et cetera, until you unpick it. And what we need to say here is that the whole speculator and the PROA story is based on the economic advice of two people. One is a sort of retired banker, and the other one is a kind of a theoretical economist with no experience in Asian markets. And these guys had never, ever, ever done a market survey on how big is the market for rhino horn in Asia. Never. But they went out and they said, we're going to flood the market. How can you flood the market if you don't know the size of the market? We do know the size of the market. And fortunately, in East Africa, there's some very good researchers, and they went out and about. And in 1978, a very well-known fact, it's undisputed, there were total around about 65,000 rhinos in Africa. By 1987, there were only 4,000 left. So in the period between 1978 and 1987, we were having 6,777 rhinos poached per year on average. But because there were only 4,000 in 1987, there were obviously a lot more rhinos poached at the start of this period. And we can calculate quickly and easily that there around about 70 tons of rhino horn were consumed in 1978. Please remember this figure, 70 tons of rhino horn. That was the market in 1978 with a poor Asia, where there was not the money to buy anything you wanted. Asia consumption was around about 70 tons per year. Then South Africa in 2014 did a study on the legalization of rhino horn trade and its viability. They got the best scientists out, and this study worked out that South Africa can supply a maximum of 5 tons of horn per year from existing stocks, from rhino shavings, and from future mortalities. It starts off at about 2 tons a year, and then if you aggressively grow rhinos, you can get to maybe 5 tons a year. So we know on the one hand that global supply was 7, but we can only supply 5 tons. And if you go supply and you open up the market and you go and drive demand, and world demand increases because you're now encouraging consumption, we can supply 5 tons. global demand is 70 tons. We know for sure the criminal syndicates will climb in there and they will satisfy the difference between supply and demand. And if we think that we can go out to the world and flood the markets without poaching being increased, we have got no chance at all. And the only people who will benefit from this will be the criminal syndicates. So we can comfortably say that we can never flood the Asian markets with the amount of rhino we can produce from stocks, shavings, and mortality. So let's bury that one. Myth number 2, CITES trade bans on the sale of rhino horn have never saved the life of a single rhino. So there's a big movement that you cannot have trade bans because they never work. And I'll give you a clip.
Everyone looks at the anti-trade lobby. Well, they've had since 1977 to try to enforce a system which has not been successful by any standard of measure, despite CITES ban, despite international legislation, despite Interpol, Europol, and the concerted efforts of all of those who have attempted. The ban from CITES saved the life of a single animal.
Very powerful statement. And you go, wow, well, therefore we must not ban and we must trade. But let's look at some numbers. The gray lines here, sorry, a little bit complex on your screens probably. The gray lines are black rhinos. The yellows are white rhinos. And they had this most extraordinary decline of black rhinos up until 1993. And what happened in 1993? For the very first time in history, the numbers of black rhinos and white rhinos started to climb together to a peak of around about 2011, 2012, maybe 2000 total. We don't know what the total is now. You know, the government's quite concerned about giving out the information, but let's assume that there's 13, 14,000 rhinos in total, black and white. But what happened in 1993, that at that time, both black and white rhinos started to increase in numbers. Let's switch that around and let's look at the poaching numbers. And you'll see exactly at 1993, poaching had gone from 10,000 a year down to in absolute almost zero by 1994. What happened in 1993, 1994 to ensure that both black and white rhinos were increasing in numbers and the poaching had gone from horrific numbers to almost zero? What happened right then and there was that CITES, right the way around the world, everybody obeyed CITES legislation. Even countries like Yemen, which weren't CITES signatory, obeyed the no trade rule. And there was a complete blanket ban of all trade in rhino horn from the end of 1993. China in January 1994 went and burnt all their rhino stocks. The American government implemented the Pelley Amendment, and they went to countries like Korea, like Taiwan, etc., and said, if you do not stop consuming rhino horn, we will not buy your electronics. And within 1 year of a complete CITES ban, there was no poaching at all. And that golden period lasted about 15 years. Until what happened? Why did the poaching in South Africa escalate? Well, we created our own loophole. We went to the world and said, we're managing our stock so well, can we have an exemption? And our rhinos went on to Appendix 2. There was a loophole. And what happened in that loophole? Criminal syndicates said, fantastic. They came in, and Vietnamese, either directly or indirectly through Eastern Europe, bought over 1,000 legal rhino hunts. And you'd remember those stories. Here's this guy, Chim Long Leng Tong Tai, and he's working for a guy called Kia Vasang in Laos, one of the biggest criminals. He's got $1 million bounty on his head. And we allowed them to go and buy our rhino hunts legally. They went out, you remember that photograph in the Sunday Times, of employing all these prostitutes to come out and shoot a rhino, because you could only have so many rhino hunts per person. So they brought in all the prostitutes, they came in, and they, in theory, shot the rhinos. Of course, they didn't shoot the rhinos, but it was now legally done. And 1,000 CITES permits and their horns left South Africa and went to Asia. It meant that the criminal syndicates were sitting 1,000 rhino horn CITES permits. And at the point of sale over there, you can't tell the difference if this is a legal rhino horn or this is a legal rhino horn. And they were able to use those CITES permits to start laundering illegal rhinos and rhino horns into Asia. And why did they start that? Well, the cost of the rhino hunt started to go up. And instead of paying R500,000 per rhino hunt, they said, fine, let's spend 50,000 and we'll start poaching. So these little loopholes, we shot ourselves in the foot here in South Africa. We created the loophole for criminals from Asia to come in and exploit the loophole, which created the tsunami of rhino poaching. And then the criminal syndicates, they are the best capitalists on the planet. They worked out different ways to try and get markets going. And their famous one was General Yap. General Yap, if you're a Vietnamese, was like Mandela. He was the guy who threw the French out of Vietnam. He threw the Americans out of Vietnam. He was the most successful general in history in that neck of the woods. And they created a rumor that when he was in his mid-80s, that he got cancer and he was cured by cancer. Now, there's no oncology hospitals in Vietnam. And if you're dying of cancer, you would do anything. He happened to live till about 104. But the criminals were able to exploit sentiments of people to create demand. And that's what we don't understand, is how good these criminal syndicates are at creating demand. Then it went into status symbols, currencies, you name it. They created everything until they drove the price way up. So basically what I'm trying to say, folks, is the CITES bans did work. But because South Africa was kind of isolated from what was happening in East Africa, we had kind of the Zambezi was the limit of our exposure. We didn't know what was going on in East Africa. But when you look at the numbers, the CITES bans for rhinos and for elephants, as we'll see, did work. Myth number 3. Now, because we can't get our way, we want to leave CITES. Now, the reason why we're not getting our way with CITES is that there's 183 parties, and you've got to get 2/3 of those votes to change legislation. At the best, South Africa can get 20, 30 votes at the moment. Why? Because the rest of the world understands that trade does not work. So then we're now starting to get grumpy about that. We're not getting our way. We try and bully our way at the CITES meetings. And we're saying, well, maybe we're going to leave CITES. But if we leave CITES, we still will not be able to trade with most of the Asian countries because they are CITES members. So who does that leave to go and trade with? North Korea. Are we going to go and trust our rhino horn to go and trade with North Korea because we can't trade with Taiwan or China or Korea or whatever it is? Are we going to do that? Are we prepared to risk our rhino by going through an illegal regime like North Korea, who will then have to smuggle it into China to create value? Of course we can't do it. We've been the pariah nation before. We don't want to be the pariah nation again. That is all 1994 and before. So can we leave CITES? Well, we're not going to change CITES legislation. And to leave CITES and go on our own would make us a pariah nation. I don't think we can. Myth number 4, South African domestic rhino horn trade in 2009 was the cause of rhino poaching. And it's a great one-liner. If you look at this graph and you're sort of, oh my goodness, 2009, yes, the domestic ban must have caused the poaching. But when you look at it from the government's point of view at that point, the most extraordinary poaching scourge had just happened before your eyes in the years before then. They did it genuinely out of the fact that the poaching escalated to such a high degree. And the local demand for rhino horn has been proved to be almost zero. So if there's no demand for rhino horn locally, I mean, which out of us wants to have a rhino horn on our mantelpiece and go through all the paperwork and all the hassle? Not many. There's very few South Africans who want rhino horn. The demand for rhino horn is from the Asia. And this was proved after the moratorium was turned over by court action. And they tried to sell rhino horn to South Africans and nobody bought. So eventually they had the website translated into Vietnamese and Chinese. Now, this is supposed to be domestic trade. Everybody here has some smattering of English. Why would you go and translate this into Vietnamese and Chinese unless you were selling to Chinese and Vietnamese? Yes, you might buy them here and you're going to sell them here legally, but they're going to export it illegally. So this is bending the rules stuff. This is going against the spirit of the legislation. We should not be selling to Vietnamese nationals in South Africa. It's gray and it's borderline criminal. And there's a paper which came out the other day, and you can see in the sort of highlighted brown area, the key arguments presented here in line with support for the reinstatement of the rhino horn trade moratorium in South Africa. That has to go back again. We have to get rid of all loopholes. Myth number 4, South Africa's domestic trade ban in 2009 was the cause of the rhino poaching. No, it was not the cause. Myth number 5, rhino horn sales can fund rhino conservation and security. Well, we've got the best example, which was elephants. We went and sold a whole lot of ivory stocks to China and Japan in 2010. We sold 108 tons. And that money, which was earned, goes to Central Treasury. We can't ring fence money for conservation and security. It goes to Central Treasury and they allocate it. From what I've heard and what I've read and what I've been able to find out, that money, the best it did was to build a mortuary in Kruger National Park. So to make this work, if you want to sell rhino horn, you've got to have a CSO. But CSOs are illegal, as we found out with diamonds. You cannot have a legal CSO on the planet today because of world trade unions. So the only way you can sell a whole lot of rhino horn is when it's done government to government. So South African government will have to go along and they'd have to go and meet with the Vietnamese generals. Now, can you imagine the murky stuff and the brown envelopes which will go between our South African officials and the Vietnamese or whoever you're trying to deal with, Kiev-Assam? And how much of that money is going to come back here? And will that be enough for conservation? No, it won't be, because whatever does come back is going to be ring-fenced into central coffers. So we can't have rhino sales to fund rhino conservation and security. One person can't go and trade it because it's illegal to trade internationally anyway. So it's got to be on a fund and it can't happen. So this is a myth. Trade in ostriches and crocodiles has saved them, therefore proving that trade in rhino horn will save us. This is myth number 6. But we want apples with apples. We can't compare a fast breeding animal like an ostrich or a crocodile and compare them to a rhinos. And all you have to do is go and get a calculator. You go and get an ostrich in a high intensive breeding area will produce 40 eggs, 40 small ostriches per year. You go 40, 40, 40, 40. And 4 generations of ostriches, you get over 2 million ostriches. So how can you compare ostriches and crocodiles? The same numbers will be with crocodiles. How can you compare that to rhinos, where we're slow breeders? They take a long time to breed. You cannot compare ostriches and crocodiles. It's a fantastic one-liner, but it's a myth. It does not work. So the other story is, yeah, no, rhino horn will keep prices high. And then you speak to somebody else and they say, whoops, I'll keep prices low. Oops, hang on, let's try and go back. So the issue is you try and put the prices high because you want to have money for conservation and for security. But if you have the prices high, then the poachers are going to use the difference to go and milk the poaching. If you put the prices too low, there's not going to be enough money for security and conservation anyway. So either the prices which are too high or too low, I mean, at the low prices, doesn't matter how low you make the prices, it's still going to be more expensive than the guy jumping over the fence of Kruger National Park with a panga and a bullet. There will always be people who can make it cheaper than we can sell at low prices. So the high prices, low prices don't work. And this is very clearly put out in a whole lot of economic papers around the world. The most famous one was Professor Nadal from the University of Manchester. He created this extraordinary document about wildlife trade into Asia. And the results are very clear. Absolutely no chance. He says it's reckless and it's negligent if you start to think of trading wildlife to save them. And it's a complicated paper because international trade into Asia is complicated. And when the speculators got hold of this thing, the one guy said, well, it's too complicated, I can't read this. And the other guy said, well, he's a Marxist, it's irrelevant. And these are the one-liners to dismiss this paper. But there are so many papers which come to the same degree. You cannot use trade to save endangered species in the wild. You can't have high prices, you can't have low prices, you can only have no trade. Communities can benefit. This is another myth. So this is a picture of Kruger Park. So yes, we all want communities to benefit from tourism and wildlife, but where are you going to put your rhino farm? Is it going to be there? there, there, there. What about the people in the between? And this is what it looks like. This is the boundary fence between Kruger Park and the communities. Where are you going to put the rhino farm? And if you put it in right in the middle here, this community is going to benefit, but what about the next community? And I promise you one thing, and each and every one of us, if we were put into a situation that there was rhino horn down the way and we were missing out and our families were going to starve, we would hop over the fence and we'd be the first people to go and poach this rhino. The issue is not creating rhino farms for communities. The issue is bringing the communities into the wildlife and tourism industries at scale. That's the only solution. And this entire story was best illustrated by vicuñas. Vicuñas have been this poster child for the pro-trade lobby and the guy who did all the vicuña farms in Chile was Cristian Bonacic. He was the guy, he devised this idea, took the idea from South Africa, and he created all these vicuña farms. They were incredibly successful, and the numbers sort of doubled and quadrupled on these farms, and it was celebrated around the world as this huge success. And then suddenly they started to do counts of the wild vicuña in their parks to find that the vicuña in the parks were plummeting, the wild vicuña were plummeting, while the farm ones were going up. So what do we want? Do we want vicuña in the wilderness, or do you want vicuña on the farms? Dr. Bonacic had such a skrik from his results of his survey. He came over to South Africa to try and get the South Africans to move away from Chile. He spent 3 months in South Africa going from institution to institution to say, listen, this is it. I drove the trade agenda for vicuña in Chile. It is a failure. Our numbers in the wild are plummeting. Please don't do rhino. And it is always on deaf ears. Communities cannot benefit from rhino farms. The only way is to bring them into the industries at whole. Rhino horn has been used by the Chinese and by Asians for traditional Chinese medicine for millennia. Can't be stopped. That's absolute nonsense. When the Americans went in with the Pell Amendment to Taiwan and Korea, Taiwan in particular was a very, very high consumer of rhino horn. Within 1 year, all consumption had stopped. Millennia of consumption of rhino horn stopped in a year, and today there is still no consumption of rhino horn, or very, very little, negligible consumption of rhino horn in Taiwan. So the story about that traditional Chinese medicine is a myth. It can be stopped. Rhino horn can be sold. We'll sell our rhino horn to TCM markets in China. My goodness. The Chinese stopped that in 1994. They briefly tempered with this last year. They opened it up for a couple of weeks and they were absolutely lambasted by the world, and they closed it down again. The Chinese do not want to buy rhino horn. And so on and on and on these myths go on. They're great one-liners. They sound fantastic. But remember where they came from. They came from speculators throwing out one-liners who've never done a market research of what the size of the market is, what happens over there. They're great one-liners over here. And then 2-3 days ago, can you believe it? We got what we call the 16th of May myth. And it's all about South Africa's current ban on the sale of cigarettes has not worked. Can South Africa draw parallel lessons to rhino horn trade? And this came about with Julian Rademacher, incredible journalist and writer who wrote that wonderful book about the rhino trading and all the rest of it, killing for profit. And he's a really great journalist, and he gets into things in great detail. And then lo and behold, so he's talking about that cigarette bans haven't worked. Now we know that from the prohibition we know that from drugs. All these addictive substances, which can be mass produced at scale to meet any market amount. If you try and ban them, the bans do not work. We agree that. So what happens? Michael Sasrolf goes and posts this little tweet. Any parallel lessons we can draw relating to rhino horn trade ban from the cigarette example? My goodness. Now, the reason why I'm raising this is Michael Sasrolf, who's the guy who's the advisor to all the speculators and the pro-traders. This is the guy who's on Minister Creasy's panel to advise the economics of making all the trade. And he does not understand that you cannot compare cigarettes, which is a mass number, easily produced, and it's got an addiction to it, to a rare commodity like a rhino horn. Simply put, 1,000 rhinos and their horns can't fit into 2 billion Asians. Doesn't matter. And for him, this is the prime economist who's advising the country and advising the speculators to have this type of attitude. And if we continue like this, I will guarantee that all of our grandkids will not see rhino in the wild. We have to be absolutely clear on this thing. So this is, we call the 16th of May myth, just a few days ago. And you'll guarantee there'll be more myths, more one-liners coming on as they get more and more desperate to try and get the trade legalized. How do you stop rhino poaching? Clearly, there has to be international, complete and no loopholes CITES trade ban. That's without, as soon as you have one loophole, understand the criminals will do it. Then we have to ramp up demand reduction campaigns in Asia, and then a whole host of stuff around Africa. You guys know what it's all about. But the most important one is we've got to stop mixed messaging from Africa. We go to the Asians and we say, please don't buy a rhino horn, they're rare. And then we go and say to them, we want to sell them. My goodness. And then whistleblower funds, community integration, et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at elephants, the same type of principles happened with elephants. And when you go out today and you see these extraordinary calm animals right next to your vehicles, and it was never like that. I started in the 70s, I said, and the elephants were wild in those days. They were being tormented, they were being harassed, they were being poached. We had numerous instances, rhinos, to the extent that when we were doing safaris, we went in the opposite direction when we saw elephants. They were absolutely wild, but we do have good data. Cynthia Moss, Ian Douglas Hamilton, and all these East African collecting data, and they were operating. And they worked out in the last 10 years before 1990, the elephant population in Africa went from 1.3 million to 600,000 in just 10 years. Good data on that. And it was mainly sold to the Western markets, America. I'm embarrassed to say, but I had a elephant hair bracelet like every safari guide. And we had all these strange artifacts which were being sold around the world. It was just normal. And when you look at the elephant range of what happened over this period, it just disappeared into nothing. So President Moi, they were the main tourism industry. President Moi from Kenya went out and he canvassed the world with Richard Leakey. And he said, to stop the poacher, the trader must also be stopped. And to stop the trader, the final buyer must be convinced not to buy ivory. I appeal to people all over the world to stop buying ivory. And the two of them managed to stop all consumption of ivory by getting elephants onto Appendix 1. In 1989, there was now every single elephant in Africa was Appendix 1, no loopholes. And you look at this graph, this is all the way through Africa. Have a look at this graph and this absolute persistent line from 1976 all the way to 1990. And that's when CITES 1 appendix, no loopholes occurred. And look at the golden years for elephants. What happened? Why? What precipitated this decline? South Africa sold our ivory to China. We again were the world. We said we want our ivory to be sold to raise money for conservation. We created the loophole, and the criminals said, thank you very much. And from that day onwards, we had huge problems. The message, though, was in 1990, the CITES global ban with no loopholes on all trade in ivory did work. It worked for rhinos, it worked for ivory, and it works for lots of other things. And then the elephant story keeps going. Mike Chase from Elephants Without Borders got a whole lot of money from Poland, $7 million to conduct the next census from 2014 to 2016. They flew all the savannah countries, and they had 90 scientists cooperating, and the results were quite extraordinary. In the previous 7 years, we lost 30% of our elephants. Tanzania had lost 60%, 53% decline in Mozambique in 5 years. Clean, absolute data, no missing. Over that period, 20 to 30,000 elephants poached per year, one elephant poached every 15, 20 minutes. Extraordinary, because South Africa went out and legalized, created the loophole. And we dug our own trench and we fell in there. And from that, we created the poaching conservation, the poaching tsunami. So that is 2016. And then Mike Chase and the Elephant Without Borders went to IU, the Congress in Hawaii. There was 10,000 scientists there, and they announced the results of the elephant survey. At the elephant meetings at IUCN. Remember, IUCN is very pro-hunting, very pro-sustainable use, very pro-utilization of animals. At this one, in the elephant room, 90% of the delegates, voting delegates, voted against trade. They were the first time that there was a complete switch in recent times away from trade. And what happened? The next year, China closed down all its ivory carving shops. The price of ivory fell from 2,100 US dollars a kilogram to 700. And then the most extraordinary numbers came through. Remember that Tanzania had this massive poaching problem. STEPS, which is the Southern Tanzania Elephant Program, reported that just 3 elephants were poached in 2018. And last year, 0. Because why? We started to close down markets. Once you close markets and you stop trade, then you start to see the benefits. And what happened the last couple of days? In response to Corona, China is considering offering to pay out all the Chinese wildlife traders in China to shut down trade in meat markets. Now that is an extraordinary event. If we can get that to happen, we're on the run. So this Barbara Creasy story about trade in ivory, I mean, it's passé, it's gone. It does not work, it cannot work. The 26 or 27 panelists, all but completely pro-trade. She's going to drive a trade mechanism through. She's going to drive it as fast as she can. I don't know what the agenda is and why, but it does not work. And we're going to create further complications for ourselves. And if you look at what's going to stop elephant poaching, it's exactly the same as rhinos. We've got a CITES bans, no loopholes. The bans did work. And then we look at her last little story, which is lion bones, leopard skins, and the conservation merits of this. Now, my goodness, to go and trade lion bones. I mean, we've had the whole Bloodline story. Bloodlines has gone out on a campaign second to none, and they've canvassed the best conservationists in lion biology around the planet. And there's not one organization or one serious biologist who says that trade in lion and lion bones is going to be beneficial for conservation. Absolutely not one. And yet we're pursuing this. We sold 1,600 lion carcasses to mainly criminal syndicates in Asia. And Kiev Sang, the very same guy who's been poaching our rhinos, is one of the main buyers. And what's this going for? Items like tiger cookies. The lion bones and tiger bones are very similar. Tiger wine. Can you believe it? In this day and age, we are drinking tiger wine and we're eating tiger cookies because it's believed to be strong. And what's happening now? And this is where the health comes in. And we're going to have to talk about health because that's where this is all going. And it's for every single product you can find, whether it's bear bile or succulents, American ginger, teak, wood, rosewood, bats, donkey skin, which is happening now, shark meat, oh my goodness. Every single species which is endangered and threatened, where you create a legal market, you will have the criminals exploiting the illegal. So we've talked about the shark industry. And I'm putting this back in here because we've got to remember that little gains may seem to be successful for the handful of people who are benefiting, but it destroys the viability of huge amount of other people's jobs and the economic benefits for those places like Gansbaai. So one little tiny benefit has got major negatives if it's not done properly. And this whole story of terms and references, I think as an industry, as a country, we've got to push back hard. We've got to reduce it. We've got to get rid of it. And to conclude, and I know we're running out of time, but I want to just kind of sum up where I'm going. We've got to be very careful about people's motives. And when people are out there trying to make a huge amount of money at the expense of animals in the wild and the future of our grandkids, I think we've got to look at, we've got to look carefully at the science of the numbers they're putting out. And the science conclusively proves that there is no conservation value in trade. Trade creates legal markets through can be laundered. Thus, legal and illegal trade are intertwined as to be functionally inseparable. I'm reading from the EMS report, which is out there, and I urge you to try and get it. Any captive breeding and trade legitimizes, normalizes, and increases consumption, which renders demand reduction campaigns ineffective and puts wild species at further risk of extinction. Folks, you've got to follow the money. Policies and this drive to get trade is going to definitely impact on the viability of our animals in the wild, on the tourism industry, which at the moment supports 1 in 7 South Africans. We have to focus on the big picture, not the tiny little wins which might happen here and there. And where does this all link to Corona? We're all kind of landlocked here in South Africa. I haven't been out my house for 55 days, all because of Mrs. Corona. She's caused havoc in our life. And we must remember that 60% of all human diseases and around 70% of all emerging infections are zoonotic. In other words, they come from the wild. Look at HIV, look at Ebola, look at SARS, MERS, even the bubonic plague. They all managed to move from wild animals through another species and onto human beings and have chaotic effects on our health. So what's now happening is that trade is now going to become not only a conservation issue, it's now going to become a health and an economic issue. We stop trade in its tracks right now, purely on health issues and purely on economic issues. I'm going to put the conservation as well. All three of these things are going to be dramatically impacted if we couldn't. The trade in wildlife, whether caught or farmed, has triggered a global pandemic. It not only threatens the lives of wild animals, but also the lives of human beings. A persistent and growing appetite for wild tastes and exotic products has created the perfect storm for the next human pandemic. From every angle, trade does not work. And I want to leave you with two numbers. When I was born, there were 450,000 wild lions in Africa. Now there's less than 23,000 in my lifetime. Elephants, there were 2 million, and now we're down to less than 400,000. The time is now to take a stand. And if we are going to go and make sure that our kids have to enjoy as we have to start making action now. Thank you very much.